It's great to be joined today by economist Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, currently a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. So we've had about 100 days of Trump, a little more than 100 days so far, and there have been scandals and there have been funny quotes and disturbing incidents, et cetera, et cetera. But the big picture that you've been observing is that a lot of what we are seeing now happen sort of at the systemic level of this administration is directly tied to the system of capitalism that we have in the United States. Let's start there. How can we sort of conceptualize this?
Well, I think what we have is a system that has come to the end of a very long period of solid growth, period of reasonable, well performance in terms of the mass of people. Despite the crash of the 1930s, it was a system that was able to deliver rising real wages to the American working class. It thereby persuaded that class, at least for a while, that it could deliver an American dream to everybody: a decent home, automobile, vacation, college education for your kids, and so on. That is over, and that stopped around the 1970s when American businesses, having recovered from the loss of face and power of the Great Depression, kind of took it on themselves, exemplified by Reagan, to push back, to be able to reestablish the kind of dominance they had before the Great Depression. And partly they did that because they always wanted to. They didn't like the Great Depression taxing them and creating all these programs for the mass of people. But also they had to compete more and more with Europeans, with Chinese, with Indians. And they didn't want to spend money on social programs. They wanted to make profits for their businesses. You put all that together, and since the 1970s, basically two things have happened. One, we have replaced workers with machines, computers, now robots, with a kind of frenzy that says, look, you got higher wages, but that's over. Because you get high wages, we now have an incentive to replace you with machines. And what we can't do in the way of replacing you with machines, we're going to do by moving our production to where the wages are much cheaper. Hence the enormous exodus of American jobs overseas and the bringing of a growing flood of immigrants, low-wage immigrants, into the United States. When you put all that together, it's over. That is, the American dream delivery to the American working class is done. Corporations don't feel the need to do that anymore, neither political, nor can they afford it in terms of their own profit plans. They can make a fortune of money by producing for the rest of the world, in the rest of the world, and or with machines. And I don't think anybody has come to terms in the United States with what I just said. In other words,
let's pick it apart in a couple pieces if we can. I mean, I think that
sure.
I observed during the general election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton that there was a lot of talk about, quote, bringing jobs back. There was talk about trade, which became something that, Donald Trump actually garnered many supporters for, even though there was a very limited understanding on their and his behalf of what those talking points even really meant. And not mentioned in that was the issue of technological unemployment. And historically, new technologies still had a net positive effect on employment because although they were destroying the need for some jobs, they were creating brand new industries. And now it appears that we're in the phase of a net negative impact on employment as a result of automation. Neither Trump nor Clinton mentioned that. And my read of it, and I'm curious what your sense is that it's a lose-lose. In other words, the first candidate to mention that will be called out by the other candidate as basically having admitted defeat in a sense, even though they would just be stating a sort of empirical reality. Is that at least part of why we didn't hear that conversation during any of the debates, during campaign ads at any point?
I think that's part of it. I would also argue that while it is easy and convenient and has a long pedigree to bash foreigners for giving jobs at lower wages to our corporations as if the corporations were passive and victims in all of this, that has a long pedigree. Attacking technical progress doesn't. And it's very hard for American politicians or anybody else to figure out how to say that in a way that doesn't make you look like you're anti-progress and also doesn't bring down on you the rage and anger of the entire employer class who wants no interference whatsoever in its freedom to replace people with machines. Even though economically speaking, it's always an open question. It's never a settled matter whether or not when you replace a working person with a machine, this is a social advance or not. If that person is unemployed, if the community where that person lives is therefore confronted with that unemployed person, with fewer taxes paid because that unemployed person is unemployed, et cetera, when you start looking at the social consequences, it may very well be, and often is, that a technological quote unquote advance is no advance at all. And that has to be faced, but it has become a political taboo that you can't go there. So you can have conversations about jobs leaving, but you can't have a conversation about automation being a negative impact situation in our country.
Don't we need to be thinking of a sort of paradigm shift in terms of the relationship between working and income as a result of this technological issue? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that, in the same way that now we laugh when we say, all those people who were saying the automobile will eliminate the jobs of the horse buggy driver, maybe we should never have developed the automobile because we would have saved those jobs. I mean, it seems sort of silly now, in a sense, to think about suppressing, we could argue whether it's progress or not, but what's sort of presented as the advancement of technology. Isn't there a different conversation we need to be having?
Yes, I think so. I think, in fact, it's always been a kind of a childish debate. Do you allow technical progress or do you prevent it? Those are not the only options. Let's take your example of the horse and the automobile. There was an alternative between the horse and the automobile, namely a system of mass transit, a system in which the basic movement of people and goods was to be accomplished or could have been accomplished by a combination of rail traffic, of van and bus traffic, the whole notion that you have to have a vast array of individual automobiles, most of which spend most of their lives on the street or in a garage, is not at all logical or anything rational at all. It's very good if you're the manufacturer of private automobiles, and those companies made sure that was the outcome. But that was good for their profits. It wasn't some necessity of technological improvement. And the real question of a rational society, not driven by capitalist profit, would have been to say, okay, we need to transport people. Now, let's think through what the ways are. Let's plan them. Let's have a mixture of mechanisms that allows for flexibility in the face of new technology. A rational way of dealing with these things was never even on the table because we don't handle our problems that way. We let the private market profit mechanism roll and then spend the following 25 years persuading ourselves that what happened through private profit was the best thing, the only thing, the necessary thing. That's crude rationalization, but it's what passes for politics in our country.
Let's pick up the conversation there with economist Richard Wolff, and that's exactly where we will resume on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation with economist Richard Wolff, professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. We stopped yesterday talking about sort of rationalizations that we often hear, particularly retrospectively, of major economic consequence that have been made in the past. Let's go back to what we've seen during the first 3+ months of Donald Trump's administration. And one of your criticisms that you recently wrote and I read is that when it comes to Donald Trump, or really any elected official at the national level now, there's sort of an Overton window of what counts as a valid criticism of policy. And they're usually pretty narrow. It could be a critique of an interest rate or of what the tax brackets should be, or something along those lines. And there's a very clear avoidance of any broader systemic critiques. This is sort of inherent to the system we have, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a kind of put your head in the sand approach that says it's too scary, it's too open-ended to ask the really big questions. Is our system broken? What alternative systems could we look at? These kinds of questions have been written off the agenda for so long that we've become accustomed to debating details. Should the Federal Reserve raise or lower interest rates this month or next month? Should. All of these elaborate questions that generate papers with detailed mathematical studies. This is all an attempt to keep control of an economic system that's spinning out of control. That's why it is so bizarre, and why the conventional make-believe everything's in order that you would get from a Bush or from a Clinton sounded so hollow to the American people, and rightly so. Of course, the decision they made to go with the blustery bully who says and shoots from the hip and all the rest, that's just a temporary attempt to break out of what is clearly inadequate, even though what you get in its place is mostly bravado and then the carrying out of a very conventional right-wing GOP program of the sort that the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal have been advocating for decades.
Fellow New School professor Federico Finkelstein has written about the difference between left and right-wing populism, or progressive and regressive populism. Have you been at all surprised at the effectiveness, I guess, during the lead up to the election, but also sort of in terms of the rhetoric we've heard from the current administration during their first 100 or so days? Have you been surprised at the effectiveness of taking what is populist-sounding rhetoric for the people, so to speak, but then using the scapegoating of immigrants and some of these other tactics you've mentioned in order to point to particular paths forward? Should we be shocked that that has been relatively effective, or is that to be expected?
No, I believe, unfortunately, it's to be expected. You know, we had 40 or 50 years now of very bland oscillation between middle-of-the-road Republicans and middle-of-the-road Democrats. Each of them pushed their more extreme formulations to the side because of the long history of smashing the left in America. The Democrats were more assiduous in squelching their left wing than the Republicans were in squelching the right wing. They always let that right wing play in their sandbox. That's why you could have a Tea Party. That's why it had a place in the Republican Party, as it always has had. But you're basically seeing this collectively comfortable middle disappear. People are too angry. People are too clear in their minds that whatever else happens, more of the same is unbearable. It is simply costing too many people too much of that American dream, elusive as it was, that they can see slipping away from them, and even more so from their kids. So they want at least the rhetoric, the ability to maybe believe, even if it's only for a little while, that Trump gets it, that Trump is going to make a difference. He talks like that, he explodes with the kind of petulance and upset that maybe makes other people feel they're validated in their feelings like that. But let me warn everybody, and Mr. Trump, if he's listening, you're creating the expectations for some kind of breakthrough that's going to solve the problems. There's nothing like that coming down the pike. That's what Mr. Trump is having to learn. And no matter how much bluster he does, and no how much theater for the media, sooner or later, masses of people, particularly his people, are going to recognize that it's more of the same, more of the same. And at that point, the bluster will no longer work. And you have to be a little scared about where that might go, because these people have invested a lot of hope, a lot of being different from the mainstream in America to endorse this Trump. If he turns out to have been a gamer, somebody who's busy feathering his own wealth nest while the rest of the country continues basically to go on as it has, the anger that will turn on him will not be pretty to watch.
So let's dig into that idea of being within or outside of the mainstream. I mean, you've pointed out, and I think most of our audience sort of has an understanding that the majority of Republicans are sort of moderately right, and most Democrats are sort of a very, very moderate left, if left at all by the standards, particularly of other countries. When you look at Donald Trump, do you see something that is actually drastically outside of that sort of normal spectrum, or is it rhetoric that sounds different, but it's really within that spectrum we've seen over the last decades?
Very much the latter. It's rhetoric that's a little different. He has cleverly borrowed from the Democrats that he's concerned about jobs in a genuine way, that he is going to bring back the coal industry, that he's going to bring back all those manufacturing jobs. That's the kind of language that the Democrats have tended to use, guaranteeing Social Security at the same time that he talks about tax cuts is a new wrinkle. But that's all it is. When you actually look at what he's doing, it's the same old, more of the right for the right wing. But it's basically the old Republican idea. You cut taxes on business in some magic way. That's going to trickle down and make us all better off. You're going to rattle the saber whenever you can make it look like you're being Mr. Tough Guy. You then have to live with the consequences of horribly expensive wars that last forever and that the people don't even support anymore. And then you have a new one. This is not new. This is old playbook, a little bit with new pizzazz, with new characters, being a little bit outrageous, gives it more of a sense of something new. But no, this is a very traditional pro-business notion of how you solve our problems. Deregulate everything, put it back in the hands of private business, let them do their thing, because when businesses make money and make profits, we're all better off. The business community believes it, they always have. Remember, years ago, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. That mentality is the mentality that now governs, and he's going to be bold and brash and push in those directions in a way that the Bush-type Republican or the Clinton-type Democrat would also do, but more slowly, more gently, more hedged about with qualifications. But it isn't going to work. Just like the mild version isn't going to work, the more extreme version not only isn't going to work, but is going to have pushbacks. It's going to provoke people in ways that are very, very disruptive of the social peace that we now have, but is becoming thinner and thinner, literally, with every week.
Last thing I want to touch on is this idea of nationalism versus globalism in thinking about some of the pressing problems on our planet right now. My sense is that Donald Trump's brand of nationalism is particularly ill-suited to solve the problems of 2017. And thinking about climate change, for example, something that by no means respects the imaginary lines on maps. When thinking about technological unemployment, which we spoke about earlier in our conversation today, Is your sense that we are in a moment right now where the nationalist solutions sort of alluded to or proposed by Donald Trump are, it couldn't possibly be a worse time for that type of solution?
Yeah, I believe that that's probably the case. I don't take these kinds of dichotomous approaches all that seriously. The United States has never given up being a nationalist society. It's very nationalist. Its military posture is very nationalist. Its cultural self-identification is highly nationalist. So I see our nationalism as always there. I also see that capitalism has globalized everything over the last 40 or 50 years, and that the United States had no choice but to get involved in all of that and eventually become a leading player in all of it. So it has a mixture of global interests and national pressures. And all that's happening now is that there's a bit of an adjustment. The global picture is giving more and more power and importance to places like China and India and so on. And the United States not used to that. It's used to a globalization in which its dominance isn't really questioned. So it could indulge a globalization and still do its nationalist thing. That's over. That's part of what I meant earlier when I said the historical success of American capitalism is over. And now it's a time of cutting back, and everybody's making sure that the cutback does not affect them. And what you're seeing is a Trump beginning to ride the nationalist horse in the hope of getting a better international globalization. But that's not in the cards. That's not available to the United States. We have neither the wealth nor the power to force that. And consequently, it's a painful adjustment in which you make lots of noise about rewriting the rules of international trade, which you cannot do, in order to improve your national situation, which has been sacrificed considerably for the money to be made by globalization. And again, Mr. Trump can twist and turn and orate all he wants. These basic adjustments in which the United States is ratcheting down, becoming less of an important player in the world economy as India and China and places like that move up into that position. Capitalism doesn't stay still, and it doesn't stay still for the United States any more than it did for anybody else before, or that it will in the future. And this reality, again, is what is not being discussed, neither by the Bushes, nor by the Clintons, nor by Mr. Trump, who wants to continue living in the way, we can fix all of this, just give me a little more time, and I'll take care of it.
Economist Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at my alma mater, the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you, David. Look forward to the next time.